Welcome to Wheaton College's Center for Faith and Innovation podcast. My name is Alec Hill. I'll be your host today. I'm the former president of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship USA. And our guest today is Derek Schuurman. And Derek's a professor of computer science at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He's a co-author with two other guys of a book entitled A Christian Field Guide to Technology for Engineers and Designers. Welcome, Derek. Glad you're with us.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, Alec.
So I'm going to give you a softball first question. Why'd you write the book?
Well, there's a long version of that and a shorter version. I can give you sort of an intermediate version. I worked for about a decade as an engineer and had not attended a Christian college like the one I teach at, but rather a large technical university, and had never ever had the opportunity to learn or think carefully about how to connect my faith with my work as an engineer. And I distinctly remember a time sitting in a cubicle farm, feeling like a Dilbert, kind of wondering, now what's the meaning of this, and how does my faith inform my work as an electrical engineer? And fast forward, I began working as a computer science professor at Redeemer University in Ontario, Canada, and was really grateful for the opportunity to develop as a Christian scholar there. There were some wonderful colleagues that I learned from. And as I grew as a Christian scholar, I began to think about how to connect my work to computer science. And that was the beginning of my first book, The Shaping a Digital World, which basically is written to computer scientists to think about connecting the dots. And then after a number of years, I had there was a little bit of a budget crisis at Redeemer, and they closed the computer science department, and I ended up at Dordt University in Sioux Center, Iowa. And after a couple of weeks of coming in there, I don't remember who exactly, but one of the administrators, I think, said to me, we need a book like Shaping a Digital World, but for engineers, right? We've got these big engineering programs. And I thought, yeah, oh my goodness, yeah, that would be helpful. But after writing my first book, I knew how much work that was. And so I nodded politely. But Dordt was very set on the idea, and they said, no, look, we can give you some funding from our Andreas Center for Christian Scholarship, and you can bring people in or whatever you need to do. Let's get this project going. And that's when we reached out to some of the other authors. Ethan Brew, the one co-author, was an engineering professor at Dordt, and Steve Vanderleest we called, and we flew him in. He was an engineering professor at Calvin for many years. He's now an engineer in the real world, working as an engineer. And we began the conversation. That was about 5 years ago, and we sketched out an outline for the book, and that's basically what emerged about 5 years later. And we were grateful that IVP was willing to work with us on that again. And we were all inspired by actually a much older book that was actually done at Calvin University many years ago by the Calvin Center for Christian Scholarship, called Responsible Technology. Responsible Technology is a dated book. It's from the 1980s or so, but it has a lot of really good, solid thinking about faith and technology. But students find it difficult to read. It's dated in its references. And so our goal was to make an update of that book, but to make it much more friendly, to have stories and pictures and images, and so that was sort of our initial motivation, and that was the process by which all the pieces sort of fell together. And so I was grateful for those two cool authors as well, to have different voices speaking into the project. But that was sort of how it came together.
So is the audience more students or practitioners?
Well, both. I think our original motivation, and I think at Dordt University as well, the thinking was, most Christian universities have some kind of a capstone course in, faith and your discipline, where you think deeply after you've completed comprehensive liberal arts sort of undergraduate education, and you have to connect the dots in a
Mhm.
multidisciplinary way, but also through the eyes of faith with your discipline. And so that was the original kind of idea, having a book that could work for a capstone class to kind of set the frame for thinking Christianly about engineering. But yes, more widely, practitioners who, like me, uh, like I did decades ago, sitting in a cubicle farm, wondering how do I connect the dots between my faith and my work as an engineer, hoping that that will be a helpful reference for those sort of folks as well.
Yeah, when I was dean of the business school at Seattle Pacific University, it was business through the eyes of faith, which is
Hmm.
the very term you just used, and that was in maybe 25 years ago, and that was kind of the beginning of that movement. So let me ask you: you start the book with this. I think it's a really beautiful chapter. But you tell the story about the Wright brothers.
Yeah.
Why do you choose them of all the historical figures you could have chosen? Why them?
Yeah, I think the whole history of flight really captures one's imagination of the development of technology, sort of the delight in experimenting. You've got these improbable inventors who are, they own a bicycle shop and they're kind of hackers, in the early days of technology, and we see how technology, oftentimes when we think about technology, we think it's, it's a way to solve a practical problem, and it's very rational and so on. But the purpose of chapter one is to say, no, technology is also more deeply rooted in our dreams. And the name of the chapter is Dreams Take Flight. And we have several examples, right? From the space program, from the early wireless or telegraph and flight, and how these stories were all, yes, solving practical problems of a sort, but they also were problems that were based in dreams of thinking about what's worthwhile, about what a, what kind of world we want to make. It's much bigger than just simply a practical exercise in making things more efficient. And so our dreams still motivate our technology today. I think engineers are still dreamers in a sense. And, uh, and of course, the question is, what kind of world do we want to build? The poem we quote is, in dreams begins responsibility, right? It's sort of,
Mhm.
what kind of world do we want to forge? And so the chapter sort of sets the stage there in terms of thinking about the origins of technology and what motivates it.
Well, I appreciate it because sometimes art and science or engineering are put in opposition to each other,
Yeah.
and that you say that they're not.
Yeah, we don't calculate new designs. We design things, right? In the way that an artist designs. The thing about engineering is that you have constraints, right? So you have to work with the constraints of materials and of the natural world and all kinds of other things. But within those constraints, there's a great degree of creativity and also responsibility, right? When you make engineering decisions, and that's where we get into later on in the book. Like as we realize our dreams, there's a whole bunch of technical considerations, specifications, and those are the things that, excuse me, most engineering programs do very well. But there's also the normative considerations, right? The sort of the way things ought to be, dreaming about what the world should be, and those norms are sort of what we sort of tag later on as design norms that we ought to be thinking about as we're creating new technologies.
The book never mentions Steve Jobs, and of course, he was not an engineer,
Yeah,
but he leaned on his engineers really heavily
he
to
did.
bend and mold. Do you have any comments on him and reflecting on his combination of art and science, even though he wasn't an engineer?
Yeah, I actually have Walter Isaacson's book
I do
actually
too. Mine's
on
right
the
behind me.
shelf right behind me. Actually,
And he's not a nice man,
no,
but he was a creative genius who understood art as design as art. And yeah, but anyway, reflect on him a little bit.
yeah, no, he's an interesting character in the world of technology. And you're right, he wasn't a very pleasant. He was very driven. He wasn't always the most friendly to his staff,
And his
according to
family. I mean,
Isaacson, and his
yeah,
family.
family.
Yes,
Yeah,
and his
yeah.
family.
But he gave us
And
beautiful products.
yeah, but he was able to dream about beautiful ways of solving some of these early technical sort of problems. And in chapter 3 we begin to talk about these chapter 4 actually the norms, the design norms. And one of the norms, the way that things ought to be for technology, is this notion of an aesthetic norm, right? That things are beautiful. And so you see in the life of Steve Jobs, I think when they were talking about when they were making the early windowing systems, he didn't want square corners. He wanted little rounded, beveled kind of corners on the windows so that they would just look more pleasing. They talk about his obsession with the color of things and the shape of things, and even the machines that made the machines. He was obsessed with what the machines in the factories looked like,
Hmm.
and then
Hmm.
his whole rather than having these sort of mono-spaced sort of typewriter type fonts, he had the notion of his calligraphy background kind of gave him the notion of thinking about what would beautiful fonts look like in a word processor. So Steve Jobs, I think, was finely attuned to the aesthetic sort of norm. How thinking how to not only make a product functional, but making it beautiful. And I think engineers today need to be thinking about these things more. Aesthetics isn't often emphasized too much in engineering programs, but I think it's an important part. Not only thinking about how something looks, but its form and its function. Going well together. And 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 uh, and and I think Apple does that very, very well. In fact, one of their products is in the Museum of Modern Art. It's just an example of just beautiful, beautiful,
Hmm.
delightful sort of industrial design. One of uh, one of the former philosophy professors here at Calvin, Nicholas Wolterstorff, has this piece where he talks about, what is a good garden spade, a shovel. It's something that works well for digging, but it's also a delight to use, right? It's this mending of form and function and aesthetics. And I think Steve Jobs was an excellent example of thinking about those wider sort of considerations. Albeit he could have been nicer to the people who were
Yeah.
working with him in the process.
You use a couple of terms in the book, technicism and reductionism, and
Yeah,
I think they tie into this conversation. How so?
yeah. So why don't I handle reductionism first? Reductionism is just this notion that things in creation can be boiled down to one thing, right? So, and one of the pitfalls of a computer scientist is to see everything as data, right? Everything can be boiled down to just data or to the mathematical representations of a situation. Um, and that is an impoverished way of looking at a holistic view of creation, right? One of the things that the biblical story kind of points out to us early on is that creation's diverse. Creation is coherent. All things cohere in Christ, we learn in the scriptures. And we need to resist all of these temptations to kind of boil things down to just the random interaction of particles or to just mathematical notations. I think this reductionistic worldview leads us into all kinds of pitfalls. If everything can be just reduced to mathematical or technical forms, then it misleads us into thinking that there's a technical solution for everything. Because if everything boils down mathematically can be boiled down in that way, then everything is subject to technological control then too. And I would suggest that not everything that counts can be counted. And so as an
Mhm.
engineer we need to think, yes, about the numerical, mathematical, physical kind of aspects of things, but we also need to be thinking about, well, the thing you brought up earlier, aesthetics. We need to be thinking about justice. We need to be, and these things are not things that can be captured in mathematical equations, right? And a wonderful book about how this applies to data, which I've also got on my shelf somewhere, is Weapons of Math Destruction. Right. So
Ooh,
it's
that's a great title.
yeah. So basically, it's about data science and how people who think that mathematics can somehow capture the essence of things, and can somehow in a neutral way solve problems and make decisions like who gets a loan, who gets a job, who gets parole from prison. That somehow, if we can express those things mathematically, right, that we will have optimized, efficient, unbiased sort of decision making. but we can't. And of course, the book is, as you can imagine from the title, basically an examination of how our technology is not neutral, and it can't be boiled down to these sort of mathematical notions that we need to exercise more responsibility in those sorts of areas. And then, just very quickly, if you have a reductionistic view of what it means to be human, then you're subject to make other sorts of I think fall into other sorts of complications when you think about, for instance, people who believe that we one day might be able to download our brain into a computer, that somehow um, everything that we are as a human can be represented in a physical or mathematical kind of way and captured, rather than appreciating that creation is complex, that what it means to be human is complex. It has a physical and spiritual element. And so a reductionistic view about what it means to be human is another pitfall, and that impacts how Christians approach AI and personhood and all these other sorts of things as well. So that's reductionism, in a nutshell.
Okay, thanks.
Um,
I'm a baseball fan, and the last 20 years with the advent of Moneyball, the book and the movie, there's a sense of putting everything into metrics and these advanced metrics and math formulas. And in one ways, they've liberated the game because teams like Oakland have been able to use that and actually get ahead. Tampa Bay is another team. Sorry to go into baseball and digress,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
but
yeah,
there's a limit to it. That's the
yeah,
point. And you don't know the heart and the soul of a player. You
yeah,
don't know the emotional and I think I won't name the player. Seattle Mariners had a great player, but he was kind of a jerk, and they traded him away. And everywhere he goes, he has great years. He has great
yeah.
statistics, but he's not. His team never wins.
Yeah, I
So
think the television show Ted Lasso, right, kind of shows like the heart of a team that goes beyond the sort of numerical ways of representing team performance and individual player performance, but having I think that show in a winsome way shows how the heart and how the social connections between players and their own lives sort of
Mhm.
impact how they operate as a team.
And what we're
Yeah,
seeing in Ukraine right now, with just heart, they would lose against the Russians. But given the weaponry, now they're able to do the quantitative and the qualitative. But all the Russians have is the quantitative and the math. They have none of the qualitative.
mm,
So it'll be really interesting to see how all that plays out. And we are complex human beings, is I guess what you're saying.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
both are necessary, quantitative and qualitative.
Yeah.
But sometimes we go to one extreme or the other. We only do art or we only do science,
Yeah,
and that's it.
yeah,
So you referred to this earlier, but you're a good Reformed scholar, so you have your creation, fall, redemption,
yeah,
sort of schema. You've already talked a bit about creation, and I don't know if you want to do some more on that, but do you want to move to the fall, or do you want to
yeah.
elaborate a bit more on creation?
No, and then I can answer the second part of your question. What's technicism?
Okay, yeah,
Which I
okay.
neglected to answer. So yeah, creation. So first of all, the creation, fall, redemption sort of narrative is sort of the big sweep of the biblical story, right? The philosopher Alistair McIntyre once said, I can't really answer the question, "What ought I to do?" unless I answer the prior question, sort of, "What story am I a part?"
Hmm.
And I think the biblical story is the story within which we live our lives as Christians. It sort of sets the backdrop for who we are. It answers who we are. It answers what's wrong with the world, what the remedy is, where we're going, and all of these things set a context for our work, in work and culture. And so creation tells us who we are as humans. It gives us a notion of human anthropology, of what it means to be human, what our calling is. It gives us a sense of the fact that God made a world that was good. We see work being something that comes before the fall, something that we're sort of created to do. But the fall, of course, is basically what's wrong with the world right now, right? And it isn't just human hearts. It's Romans 8 talks about how all of creation is groaning. So our tools and our technologies and our social relationships, our relationship with the creation, with ourselves, and of course with God is marred by this sin. And technicism is a term to basically talk about the idolatry of technology in its essence. Technicism is the faith and trust in technology to solve all of humankind's problems and to progress towards sort of our own notion of utopia, right? It's sort of a technicism is kind of like the biblical story, but without God, right? So the problem is we don't have enough technical know-how. The remedy is through science and reason and through the Enlightenment sort of
Enlightenment. Yep.
project.
Right.
We
Right.
pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and progress is inevitable. And eventually, we'll solve all the problems of humanity. And like I alluded to earlier, some people think we'll even solve the problem of death with
Y-
technology.
You know,
And
it's
so,
fascinating to me. They
yeah,
never read that. World War One. There was so much optimism in the early part of that century, and then so much of that went out the window. It's just ironic to me that that hasn't died in some circles. That sort of
yeah,
false hope in
yeah,
in our own abilities to be creative.
yeah, yeah. And of course, so the biblical story, then, so creation, fall, then there's redemption. And of course, as Christians, we see the the solution to the problem is not one that will come about through technology or any other human or creational sort of efforts. It comes through Jesus Christ, right? And I mean, that was the issue with the Tower of Babel. People were trying to build their own bridge between heaven and earth, and to make a name for themselves, it says. But of course, as Christians, we acknowledge that it's Jesus Christ who has come to redeem all things, to restore that relationship between us and God, but also to inaugurate His kingdom, a kingdom that is a cosmic vision of how things ought to be, restoring all things. So this is the sort of big, comprehensive vision that you often hear about in reform circles, right? This every square inch sort of notion. So that
A
includes
Kuiper. Yeah.
technology, that includes
Yeah.
all of life, and
So how do engineers play into this redemption motif?
yeah, yeah. So I think first of all, we see technology and all aspects of technology as being a legitimate area of creation for service to God and neighbor. It's a way that we can express our
Mhm.
love for our neighbor by creating useful products and services. I think it's a way to glorify God. I think when you study technology, you just see how wonderful His creation is. You know that these laws and these materials in creation are not arbitrary, but God has put this latent potential into creation. And ready and early in the creation story, we're given this cultural mandate, this call to sort of develop and unfold things, and so we do that, responsibly. Um, I think we can also use technology as a witness, right? So we use it in ways that are obedient to God, but also as a ways that are witness to others, or to use technology itself to help spread God's word and to show love for our neighbor in remote places and so on. But I think the one pitfall we mentioned earlier, one pitfall is people sort of see technology as a way to utopia. Another pitfall is that also people see technology as perhaps something that will destroy us. And
Right.
so I think when we think about redemption, we have to realize that technology is neither the savior nor the villain when it comes to either of these sort of approaches, and to realize that it's Christ that will usher in His kingdom. It won't be us by our own wits or by our own technology. We're simply called to sort of faithfully um, uh, make some imperfect models of the perfect world to come. That's how Lewis Smedes puts it. I like that. To sort of be a faithful presence, to be faithfully doing the things He's called us to do. But ultimately, it'll be God who ushers in the new heavens and the new earth. Um,
Did I read in the book that you wrote that technology is not morally neutral?
yes,
So what I heard you just saying, it sort of implied that technology could swing either toward pessimism or optimism, which
yeah.
sounds like it's morally neutral. But then, so unpack that.
Yeah, so the non-neutrality of technology is so important that we spend a whole chapter on it. So chapter 3, I believe, in the book basically goes through different myths of neutrality of technology. And this is always a tough nut to crack with my students when I initially begin teaching my capstone courses. There's always students who kind of squint at me and they're skeptical. And
Mhm.
I was too, as an engineer coming out of engineering school, without the benefit of a more holistic liberal arts education. I was kind of like, yeah, of course. Like, tools are tools. It's what you do with them that
It's
counts.
like fire. If fire is
Yeah,
neutral. Yeah, yeah, there
it's
you go.
neutral, right? and it wasn't until later on that I sort of developed this more nuanced and complex sort of perspective of technology, that I realized that that's a very naive way to think. And it's important to recognize that technology is not neutral, because if it is, then actually, engineers have no responsibility, because we're just making tools. It's up to the users, right, then to use the tools responsibly.
It
But
sounds
the,
like social platforms, right? That's the line
yeah,
they use.
yeah,
We're
that's
just
right.
here.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
just pass it through.
that's right. And so the people that I think have been most helpful in kind of understanding that, at least for me, are actually some of the media ecologists of like 40, 50 years ago, people like Marshall McLuhan
Mm.
and Jacques Ellul and Neil Postman is very good, very
Well, those are
readable, right?
classic
Yeah.
names. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think they apply in spades nowadays. Like, I think if you go and read those old books, and oftentimes they're bemoaning television and older technologies, but all the arguments they make apply equally, perhaps more so, to, social networks and to other forms of more modern technology. And basically their argument is that within every single technological artifact, there is a bias that sort of nudges a user to use it in a particular way. Neil Postman makes this argument that technology is not just additive, it's ecological, right? So you can imagine, if you have a glass of water and you put a drop of red dye in the water, you don't have water plus a drop of red dye. You have a whole new substance, right? And so when you introduce a new technology into an environment, it's like
Mm,
unleashing a new
mm.
species into a forest, right? It has all these complex interactions. And so we see how the smartphone isn't just, the world, since the smartphone isn't just, the world plus the smartphone. It's a whole new world. It changes politics, it changes the way we communicate, it's
Changes
the
mental
way we
health of young people, right?
mental health. Yeah, 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 yeah. Social networking the same. The show, the session, the documentary, The Social
Social
Dilemma on
dilemma. It's a
Netflix.
fat. I've watched it
Yeah.
twice. It's
And it
really
shows you it's not neutral.
well. And these designers in the
Yeah,
Bay Area won't
yeah,
let their kids use the products they designed.
yeah,
That's the
yeah.
kicker.
Yeah, that's been often referred to as the reverse digital divide, where, that the actually uber wealthy are the ones who are saying, we don't want our kids to be immersed in tech, and are making those choices. I think in part because they kind of realize these tools are kind of preloaded with certain habits and rituals, and I think as
Well,
Christians,
in that
yeah,
video, by the way, remember those
yeah,
three guys who are playing with the screens and they're watching this 15-year-old boy and they're
hmm,
controlling his life with attraction towards a girl and a product, and it's just so horribly manipulative, and
yeah,
it's overdone a little bit, but it's
yes.
very gripping scene.
Yeah, yeah. There's some parts of that documentary that I would probably quibble with, but I think
Yeah.
on the whole, it makes the point, that technology is not neutral. These algorithms are not neutral. Like, I think sometimes computer scientists can be tempted to think, well, algorithms are mathematical, right? I can express them using predicate calculus. It's math, so it's got to be neutral. But behind every one of these algorithms, our opinions about, what should be done. There are dreams, going back to our first chapter, about what's worthwhile to do, about what we want to accomplish, about what's worthwhile to measure, and what sort of things, what different ways do we want to nudge people. Yeah.
Derek, is it simplistic to say that technology has fallen like every other institution and part of life?
Yeah, I think, going back to that Romans 8 verse, the whole creation is groaning, so technology also exhibits those effects of sin, and I think that's not. I think that's a general statement that I think is a helpful way to understand what the problem is. So the solution then is not better technology,
It's
or
better heart.
yeah, yeah. It's ultimately the redemption that comes through Jesus Christ, which is something we're not going to be able to accomplish on our own.
So the book lays out technological optimists and technological
Yeah.
pessimists. Are you a technological pessimist?
I think most engineers are attracted to the discipline because they've got a little bit of optimist in them, right? And I used to delight in technology. I was a ham radio operator as a teenager. I used to build electronic circuits. sometimes for mischievous ends. But I got into the early personal computers. I keep this on my desk. It's the keyboard of my very first computer, a Timex Sinclair ZX81. It's
Ooh.
just the keyboard, but
You might be interested. I went to high school with Bill Gates and Paul Allen.
oh, no way, in Seattle there.
So there's 60 guys in my class, and I was looking at my
Ah,
20-year photo, and there's Paul Allen. Of course,
wow,
he died a couple of years ago.
yeah,
So yeah, so I grew up in the revolution without even
yeah.
knowing I was in the revolution.
Yeah, and those guys were at it. There apparently was a computer in
It
their high school, and
so
they learned. Yeah,
Bliss Hall had
yeah.
four floors, and the bottom floor was a whole
Mm.
mainframe that was purchased by the mothers as they ran rummage sales. So they bought
Ah,
this mainframe, and at 17 and 16, they were running the city lights for Shoreline, Washington. Anyway,
wow.
and if I had had any inclination,
You should have joined them.
I could have gotten on the bus, but I had no inclination. So
Yeah, no, so I mean that captured my imagination too as a kid. These early personal computers were magical. I had no idea where they would take us, but I knew there was something special here, and that hobby became my vocation essentially over time.
that's just
Yeah,
so back to the optimist or pessimist.
yeah,
You're not neutral? I mean,
no.
which way do you tip?
So yeah, I tend to be optimist, and I think especially when I was in engineering school, I think I drank some of the Kool-Aid that about how technology could provide a fix for most things. I When I look back at my undergraduate education in a secular school, no one ever said this is our worldview, but there was a way of thinking about the world and about technology that
Of course.
was implicit, sort of below the. And I had no way of detecting it at the time. I didn't have the tools. I actually didn't care to think about those things too much at that age. I was more enamored by the technology itself. But the idea there was that the world is mechanical in nature, and it's amenable to technological solutions. It's a technological worldview, and so I thought that with the technical tools I had learned that yeah I could solve a lot of the problems myself with my wits and with the skills that I had been given. And I think it wasn't until later on when I began to wrestle with the how the biblical story informs my work with technology that I began to temper that a little bit. I think we can be thankful for technology. It's a wonderful gift.
Yeah.
I think it's not too far to say that it helps push back some of the effects of the fall. I mean, medicine, things like this, right? It's a gift from God, but it's not going to be the silver bullet for what ultimately ails us. And so going back to this statement, right? We have to be careful not to see technology as the savior, and then on the flip side there's those, right, who see it as sort of the end of us, the Frankenstein narrative I talk about in the book, right? It's sort of
Prometheus, yeah, the
the
Prometheus,
Prometheus,
yes, myth, yeah,
right?
yeah,
The
yeah, yeah.
sort of the Terminator, right?
Yeah.
All these sort of movies that sort of depict technology turning on its creator and destroying them. There's this postmodern despair with technology that sees it.
Blade Runner, the
Blade Runner,
movie.
yeah, it's this
It's a
depressing futuristic world
yeah.
that's actually just kind of dark. I mean, it's just not a happy place because so I think, and that's not to say that there might be consequences of poor technology decisions in the future, that our world
Right.
could bear consequences of poor technology decisions. But I think looking at technology for either of those extremes as the villain or as the savior is something we have to avoid. And then to think about how then shall I live? How then shall I engineer? What does it mean to be a responsible engineer, to use these God-given gifts and creational possibilities in ways that show love to my neighbor and care for the earth and bring honor and glory to God? And that's that's sort of the big um, I think context for our work as Christian engineers.
Well, I'm a walking case study of technology. 6 years ago, I had a bone marrow transplant.
Ah,
So 40 years, 30 years ago, I'd be dead. I wouldn't be
mm,
here doing this interview. But through the miracle of science, here I am. And so I have a love hate relationship with technology as well because I'd be dead, and
yeah,
literally dead. And then last year I had two new hips replaced. You refer to limb replacements or hip replacements or knee replacements in your book, and
yeah,
I marked that one up. So technology has been a real friend of mine, and yet I see as a professor, I see some of the destruction in some of my students that technology has opened doors into their self-doubts and their depression and their
Yeah.
fragility that Jonathan Haidt and other authors talk about. Hey, well, let me go to Bob Moses. I was fascinated. Bob Moses was a bureaucrat in New York City for decades,
Yeah.
who basically re-engineered the whole city. And I have his book. I read his book, The Power Broker, which won a Pulitzer Prize. So when I saw that, but you said, here's the quote: Bob Moses built racism into his bridges. End quote. That's a very strong statement. Why'd you make it?
Yeah. So to be clear, that chapter was written by my co-author Steve Vanderleest, and
Okay, so you
we
could.
wrestled with that a little bit,
Yeah, yeah.
because it is a strong statement. And what we settled on was to cite Robert Moses's book, where he lays out over the course of hundreds of pages, that this idea that he and for those who aren't familiar with the story, Robert Moses was the great architect of New York City, and built many of the parks and
The
infrastructure
roads and the
and roads.
thoroughfares and
Yeah,
yeah,
and
parks.
and
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
and there was these bridges over top of freeways that would lead to the beaches, and he built these. He allegedly built these bridges in such a way that buses could not pass underneath these bridges, and the implication was that would prevent people who relied on public transportation, which is sometimes used as a proxy for race and for other disadvantaged groups, from preventing them from being able to go to the beaches where people with their own automobiles could easily do so. So Robert Moses makes this insinuation, and in fact, there's a wonderful essay called "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" That actually talks about this. Do artifacts have politics? The name of the author is Winner by Langdon Winner,
Mm.
um, and he goes and explores this in a lot of detail as well. Um, and there have been people that have pushed back. So this is why, as authors, co-authors, we had a little bit of a back and forth about that strong statement. There was someone who wrote an article in response to Langdon Winter that wrote an article called "Do Politics Have Artifacts?" Right. So you kind of flipped it around and kind of say people attributing certain things to objects after the fact. So I think if you read The Power Broker, the author who wrote that book did a lot of homework over a long period of time, and made the claim that there was some racism involved in those decisions. Um,
What
I
what what's
Yeah,
hard there is that Moses, as I recall, was the son of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. So he had this
yeah.
the Old Testament. So that makes it even more complicated.
Yes. Yeah. So to be honest with you, that sentence you just highlighted now was one that we discussed and went back and forth on a little bit. And probably, if I were to speak personally for myself, I probably would have toned down that a little bit, because it's hard to attribute motivations to people. um, but I think, regardless of where you might stand on your opinion about where his inner motivations came from, the bridges weren't neutral, because they actually did prevent people from going to the beach. And so, at the very least, if you want to have a more charitable view, he didn't think about people who rely on public transportation who might want to go to the beach. He ignored
So at
those
best,
those.
at best, it's omission. At worst, it's
Yes.
commission. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other illustration you guys use is with photographic with film. There's the way that the film is tinted
Yeah. Yeah.
favors the Caucasian. Uh, Explain that.
Yeah, so the original photochemistry for film was developed and optimized for white skinned folks, and was not developed in a way that would render darker skins as well. And so the technology itself already was biased for certain types of skin color. There's other examples and other technologies too. The telephone, right, was the frequencies that the normal telephone responds to, which is, I think, somewhere between 300 hertz and 3 kilohertz or something. But it was optimized for male voices, not for women's voices or for higher voices. So, I mean, there's all these examples about how the people who develop technologies sometimes don't think about other people groups or other gender, the other gender,
Right.
or whatnot when they're making these design decisions. Another example we give in the book is that women are more likely to have fatal accidents in
That was my next.
automobiles.
So
Yeah,
17% women, quote, women are 17% more likely to be killed in
yeah.
car crashes than men. Explain that.
Well,
That's not intuitive to me.
yeah. I mean, when you're designing cars and designing crumple zones and seatbelt mechanisms and the dash and everything else, if all you're using is crash test dummies that approximate the weight and size of an average male, then you're going to make design decisions based on that data point, right? And so,
How does this happen? How can you not? I
yeah,
mean, what? Explain to me the psychology of engineers who are testing dummies and they don't think about women as being 51% of the passengers or
yes,
drivers.
no, and I think too, when I was working as an engineer, you were trying to bring a product to market quickly. You were using your own experience to inform what that product looks like and what features it ought to have. I don't remember ever sitting down with focus groups or social scientists or anything like that. So I think that engineers alone are actually, and in fact, if you look at the population of engineers, it's mostly male, right?
Well, yeah,
There aren't,
that's right.
you go to even in Christian colleges, you look at engineering programs, and maybe there's only 20% female
Well, and
enrollment.
that's why
Computer
they're
science
added
is the
to
same.
get more male students in, right?
Yeah,
I mean, in part,
yeah,
it's like
and
having a football team.
yeah, and people of color and people with other perspectives and so on. I think engineers need the help not only of a more diverse sort of set of people around the table, but also other disciplines. We need the business folks, because of course our business is going to fail if we don't really think about the economic side of things. We need social scientists to think about some of these other questions about groups that are represented and so on. We need psychologists. We need artists. We need the Steve Jobses of the world. Perhaps less less abrasive Steve Jobses, but people who can think about those aesthetic things. We need maybe even theologians and philosophers. I think they bring insights about ethics and about um, ultimate ends and goods that can all inform technologies. And so, and that's what we see, going back to the social dilemma, that film, you see a technology that's designed to optimize viewer to optimize user engagement, and to sort of just keep eyeballs on screens and not look at any other considerations, at the expense of everything else. And uh, and so, yeah, part of it comes from just the demographics of engineers themselves, and then just the way that products have traditionally been made to technical specifications, and not thinking about the norms. So, getting back to those design norms that
Mhm.
I hinted at earlier.
Here in Seattle, the Boeing Max plane crashes have been
Yeah,
huge news. And in that story, Boeing was an engineering firm that had managers as leaders, but then it moved to Chicago, and now it's moving to DC, the headquarters at least. And the division between, so the engineers are the heroes in this story, and the business people are the villains, if I can
yeah,
be very simplistic about it. So that's a story that kind of flips it, where the business people should listen to the engineers.
yeah. Yeah, there's another Netflix documentary about the Boeing incident.
Yeah.
I forget the name of the documentary, but yeah, it sort of looks at the corporate culture, and alleges that the a shift in the emphasis of the corporate culture, shifting from an engineering driven kind of culture to a more bottom line business driven culture, was one of the contributing factors to
Yeah, it
all
was
of this.
well, it
Yeah.
was when they merged, they bought McDonnell Douglas, and
Yes.
the story goes on from there. But yeah, I watched the same documentary, and again, here in Seattle, it's big news, and it's horrible having been in
Yeah.
Ethiopia and Malaysia and seeing those crashes. It's very painful. You have a quote from Winston Churchill. I always love Winston Churchill quotes. He wrote, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards, our buildings shape us."
Yeah.
Explain that.
Yeah. So this gets back to the notion that technology is not neutral. You know, um, Marshall McLuhan said it a little more cryptically, right? The medium is the message. The thing itself has a message inside of it. TV isn't just about TV shows, but the medium of TV changes us. And when we create television, when we create automobiles, we aren't just creating means of communicating news and information, or building an artifact that can travel from point A to point B. um, it's reshaping our culture. It's ecological, like the example I gave earlier, and those ecological changes change us, right? So when I want to walk to school, I live nearby Calvin's campus. I got to navigate some very busy roads that are not pedestrian friendly. A lot of people in suburban neighborhoods don't really know their neighbors, because where they work and where they shop and where they live are separated by vast distances. The architecture of homes has changed in the last 100 years, right? The defining feature of a home 100 years ago was a big front porch, right, where you could talk to the people who walk by.
Sure, yeah.
And nowadays it's a garage or two or three garages, and
Yes.
people come home and the automatic garage door opener opens and then closes. And if they are going to sit out, it's going to be in a private patio in the
That's right.
backyard, right?
That's
So,
right.
in that way, the automobile has allowed us to move quickly from point A to point B, most days. But it also has changed our neighborhoods. It's changed community. It's changed how we know our neighbors. And so it shapes us. It shapes us as people, as communities. And that's just one example. The smartphone and social media are other examples where you can see quite quickly how the technology is shaping us in profound ways.
Derek, you spent a whole chapter in the book on the electric car,
Yeah,
um,
that was
both
my other, yeah,
past and
author.
future.
Yes.
Why have a whole chapter dedicated to the electric car?
Yeah, so that, to be clear, that was Ethan Brew, who's our local technology historian, and one of my co-authors, Ethan Brew, who has taught courses on the history of technology, and we were very eager to have him include that chapter, because technology doesn't just fall out of nowhere, right? There is sort of a historical context. There is choices that are made in the past, and pressures and dreams that inform the directions of technologies that we need to understand in order to understand the shape of things as we see them today. That chapter on the history of the electric vehicle in particular, right now, when we think about Tesla and about EVs and all the manufacturers scrambling, to create electric vehicles, what we forget is that's actually how things started. The original automobiles, some of the early automobiles were in fact electric vehicles, but that technology was abandoned. And it wasn't just because batteries were limited in range and all those sorts of, I mean, we could have solved all these problems over time had we sort of stuck in a certain direction with these things. But it had to do with, again, the dreams of automotive freedom, being able to go out into the countryside and escape the city, and because inside the city, there actually, when the automobile came along, there was lots of electricity that was being generated locally that could be used. We didn't have gas stations in every corner like we do today. Electricity was much more
Mhm.
viable for distributing to homes and businesses. Um, but that chapter actually just sketches some of the social, historical, psychological kind of forces that shaped the technological decision. We have this notion that technology sort of has a logic of its own, and the most efficient, most practical, most reasonable choices get made along the way. But there's all kinds of other factors that shape the direction and the shape of our technologies, and the EV is a great sort of working case example.
Yeah, I just found it fascinating.
Hmm.
I was also a bit surprised you went after the Amish a little bit. Nobody goes after the Amish. Come on,
Yeah,
they're kind of
yeah,
saints, right?
yeah,
So why did you have this a mild critique? It's not the Bob Moses critique. It's a
right.
milder critique of the Amish.
Yeah, again, I think that was another one of my co-authors who
Oh,
who
I love the
included
way
that
you deflect this, Derek. It's
Well, writing.
I had to co-author my next book so I can do this in an interview. This is a great technique.
Well, it's I'm trying to remember the reference that you're talking about, but I think that
Well, it's
it's a.
because let me frame it for you. So it's kind of like the Amish say that they're sort of anti-technology, and yet their horse and buggies are full of
Mhm.
technology. The wheels of technology. So it's not as an advanced a form of technology, but they're using
Right.
technology all the time.
Yes. Okay. Yes. No. And I think that that's a very helpful point to make. That actually shows us that, when we talk about technology, we're not just talking about, advanced recent technology or things that were made since we were born, but the one example I think in the first chapter we talk about how someone prays in their church that the technology will work well, and what they mean is the projector and the sound system and the streaming video and so on. But uh, zippers are technologies, right? Steps and HVAC systems are technology, and the paper in our pews, right? And stained glass windows. I mean, all these things are technologies as well. And so to kind of think about technology more broadly,
Hmm.
some of these technologies have faded into the background a little bit. There, Neil Postman talks about mythic technologies, technologies that we assume were just always there and part of the natural environment, right? For us in the West, running water and sewage are just they're just part of the natural environment, right? That's always there, and we take them for granted. They sort of, just form the background of everything. Um, but yeah, to think more widely, and I think the thing about the Amish is that they don't reject technology per se, but they make very careful decisions based on the sort of social impacts and religious impacts that certain introductions of certain technologies might have on them or their community or their faith life. And I think maybe they understand, maybe better than us in some ways, that technology is not neutral. When we introduce new technologies into our lives, our farms, our worship services, that yes, we shape our tools, but then our tools will shape us. And the question is this a way we want to be shaped, and or do we want to make certain choices?
Do you
Um,
remember the Harrison Ford film Witness? And he's an
yes,
English cop in
yeah,
Philadelphia who hides out in this Amish. And there's a
yeah,
scene where
yeah,
he's repairing his car, there's a song that comes on. It's kind of a romantic '50s song, and he starts dancing with the Amish woman, and you can see the technology of the shaping the relationship. I'd never thought
it's
of it that way.
changing it maybe.
Changing it, absolutely. This
Yeah,
back to Churchill's phrase comment.
yeah,
Yeah. So that it's a scene where technology intrudes, it enters in to the
yeah.
Amish world, and it changes her.
Yeah. And so I think the question as Christians is, when we're as users, right, we have to make the decision, if I adopt this particular technology in my life, is it going to make me more into the kind of person that God wants me to be? And then,
Hmm.
of course, for Christian engineers, the question is, as I design this technology, am I designing it in a way that's going to be to help my end users to flourish?
Hmm.
Now, oftentimes this opens up another can of worms, because oftentimes engineers are constrained by what the corporation they're working for tells them needs to be made, and so their decision making is constrained.
Right.
But you always have some choices about how you're going to, choices about environment, about product part sourcing, about features. Engineers can speak into all of these things. Um,
So, Derek, just two questions. We're almost done here. First one is the end of the book. And it's really kind of unique. It concludes with a series of emails between a professor and a former
yeah,
student. Okay, first of all, what was the purpose of that chapter, and why did you include it at the end?
yeah. I think the chapter's intention was to kind of say, well, we've given these general principles and these guidelines for developing responsible technology, um, but the situations you're going to encounter and the types of uh, you know dilemmas that you're going to see, and the sort of practical things that come up in the rough and tumble of everyday life, is going to be more complicated than just a set of basic principles, right? And so the the chapter sort of deals with certain practical situations that come up as this young engineer is just beginning his work in industry, and he's writing back to his Christian college engineering professor to ask for advice. And if I'm pushed on this, that was one of the chapters I did. it's kind of like a set of letters between my younger self, who was sitting in the cubicle farm,
Ah, uh-huh,
wondering. I
uh-huh.
mean, if you were to psychoanalyze me, you'd probably find elements of,
Were these
me.
were these real
Yeah.
emails or were they made up?
No, they're made up.
They're made up. Oh, okay.
They're all imaginary.
I bought it hook, line, and sinker. I
Oh, you
thought they were
did?
real.
Oh,
Oh yeah, I
yeah,
did.
yeah. To kind of get
But I
the
like the
through line
older. I like the Cat Stevens, the older and the younger kind of
Yeah, yeah.
thing.
And
That's
so the
cool.
older guy is kind of, me now as a, upper middle aged Christian college university professor. And then thinking about myself sitting in that cubicle farm many years ago, trying to think about how to connect the dots and thinking about, some of the challenges I encountered, or having interacted with our alumni. Students come back and they talk about, some of the things in the real world that your education doesn't necessarily, perfectly prepare you for, where you have to become a certain kind of person who knows how to wisely respond to these different situations in ways that are faithful to God's norms for his world. But yeah, so it is a little bit reminiscent of myself, but I think it's also an example of what a mentoring relationship might look like. I think
Mhm.
we all need mentors,
I
people
do.
who can speak into our lives, who actually embody that worldview, um, who kind of, make it real, and who can also pray for us. And part of the things that the sort of sage older professor says to this young engineer is that, you need to be part of a faith community too. You need to see that your vocation is not just your work, paid work, but it's also, your calling to
Mhm.
be part of your neighborhood and your church and your family and your friends, and to think about vocation in the bigger sense of the word. So it gives them a bit of a blessing at the end, and so I think I'm glad you thought they were real, because that was the intent. It was meant to
Yeah,
capture a slice of life between these two folks, and like I said, it was certainly inspired by my own experiences. So I hope that it's a helpful encouragement to young engineers who read it.
that's great. Well, final question. Anything else you want to add? Anything question I haven't asked that you'd like to address? Any topic? Anything else?
Yeah, the only thing I can say is that, there is so many other wonderful books about technology through a Christian lens. But the one thing that we found that's hard to find is, books that are written for people actually designing technology. A lot of the Christian books about technology are written by philosophers or theologians, and they rightly and prophetically talk about the challenges and the issues that technology faces. But some of the real challenges for engineers it's like, okay, but how then shall we engineer? Like, what do I do about it as an engineer, right? Sure,
Mhm.
technology is fraught with all of these pitfalls, and so that we found there's very few books that can actually speak to the people who are making technology, right? There's a lot of books that identify the problems with technology, and so our hope is that this book will be one of many, perhaps, that will be able to help encourage and equip people actually working in these fields: computer scientists, designers, engineers, architects,
Mhm. Mhm.
people who are actually forging these tools to be a faithful presence in their work, but also to pull in that phrase again, to make some imperfect models of the perfect world to come.
Well, Derek, this has been a pleasure, and thank you for writing the book, and thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
All right. Thank you.